Surprising, I hardly got started in the new class that we're in here in intertestamental period, and people were already asking books, what books to have. So, I brought a few. Praise the Lord. It's a blessing. I don't have to force anything on anyone. I wasn't going to say anything about it, and then people wanted to know something about maybe some books they could obtain. So for all of the bookworms out there, that's not a derogatory term because I'm one of them. That means you're just always worming your way around in books. Here are a couple. Introduction to the Intertestamental Period by Surburg, S-U-R-B-U-R-G. Not the best of them, by the way, but it's got material in it. Introduction to the Intertestamental Period. Surburg, S-U-R-B-U-R-G. Looks like a scholarly individual. First looks can be deceptive. I didn't mean anything by that the fellow's bad or anything. I don't know him. But I know the book. Between the Testaments, Russell, a popular little handbook. And then after someone asks about the books and they ask where to get them, and I always say, I don't know, because I can't remember where I got all of my books. But you can find them because they're around somewhere. Martin Hengel's Judaism and Hellenism. This isn't really Between the Testaments textbook, but it does cover the contrasts and the cultural struggles between Judaism and Hellenism. Hengel, H-E-N-G-E-L. Used to be 2 volumes, now they finally placed it into 1. Then the one I would recommend is just a popular little handbook. It's Between the Testaments by Pfeiffer. It's probably the best known little handbook that covers this period. There aren't a whole lot of books that cover this period, by the way. But here's the easy to read little small handbook by a well-known scholar, Charles Pfeiffer, Between the Testaments. I don't think it's going to cover all that we're covering, but it does give a lot. It covers the Persian period and the Hellenistic period. So we're really going earlier than that, and we'll be taking ourselves past that. So we're going to be on both sides of what they cover. This would sandwich right in between. And we'll get to all of this, the Persian period and the Hellenistic period. Well, he does mention something about the Romans. That's really beyond the period of the Greeks. He talks about the Maccabees. I've read the book several times. I don't remember all that's in it, but evidently it covers, for the most part, what we're going to be covering, except maybe some of the early stuff. So, in order to get to Israel, Between the Testaments, we've got to start way back and give you a quick historical review, which we gave you before in more detail in Creation and an Old Testament introduction, of the history of the Old Testament. So this just sums it all up. I'm going to give you 7 periods, because we're going to have to go back to the very beginning. Otherwise, it'd just be 6 periods for the Hebrew nation, but really 7. We have to go back before the Hebrews as a people existed. 7 periods of Old Testament history. I think we provided this for you before, but if you know this, then you know it all, at least in outline form, and it really does help, and it really does prepare you in studying and in knowing something about the whole Old Testament when you can outline it like this and work your way through the books. So where would we start? What's the date of where we would start? Someone who was here when we taught creation?
Day 1.
Which was what day? Well, how old's the earth? About 10,000 years, so what date would it be then? About 8,000 BC. Okay. The period of beginnings. We know when the world was created. Remember, Lightfoot gave us the month, the day, the time of the day, and everything. Well, we'll just say 8,000. Hopefully we're not missing it by more than a few thousand. 8,000 BC, that's as close as you can get. Remember what we studied in creation. But it's not 2.7 million, though. And it's good to know that.
That's for sure.
So you know some things about Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon. The best thing we know about them is that's how we got here tonight. The period of beginnings. Well, you had to have that class to know what that statement meant. Remember, they're the little men that run underneath your car. The period of beginnings, from 8000 BC down to Well, we don't know exactly how far, but we're going to put it down to the time of Abraham, 2167. You can say beginning, well, that might just be the first 2 chapters of Genesis. Well, that could be, but we're going to include Genesis 1 through 11, the period of beginnings. Now, we don't have to say a whole lot about that period, because that's all of what the creation class was about. Genesis chapters 1 through 11. The period of beginnings. It's just that when you say beginnings, it really makes it sound early, and it is 8,000 BC, but then we're covering several more thousand years along with that. Then in the second place, the period of the Hebrew patriarchs. The period of the Hebrew patriarchs. That is, those who are popularly referred to as the patriarchs, because even Paul could be referred to, or James, or someone else as a patriarch. But those that we typically think of when we hear or see or read the word patriarch. The period of the Hebrew patriarchs, Genesis 12 through 50. 2167 BC down to 1800 BC. This is just setting the stage for looking at the various Gentile kingdoms that had control over Israel, especially during the intertestamental period. So here we have the beginning of Israel, the beginning of the nation with Abraham. Then in the third place, what would come next? This proves whether you've got a hole in your mind, a systematic outline of all of Old Testament history. What comes next? What comes after the patriarch? Egypt, okay. Egyptian slavery and deliverance. Egyptian slavery and deliverance. It's easy for me. I've got it all written down. It's better if you can think of it without seeing it before you. Exodus through Deuteronomy. Wouldn't those be the books that would cover Egyptian slavery and deliverance? Certainly. 1730 through 1447. Why do we start 1730? I might have to go back and look myself. I think I know. Why do we start 1730? Pardon? Okay, it's when we've got the new king that knew not Joseph. Remember how it's worded back there in Exodus 1? That new king that rose up. Well, I can't find the right chart. Here we go. Because I think that's just the standard accepted date. And it may even make a comment on here. This is the patriarchs and the judges. Okay, see right there in the middle of it, 1730. See, that's just an easy date to remember. It stands out there on your chart if you've looked at these charts very often. And see, it even gives you the verse there. That's how I memorized it, by seeing it here. There arose a new king over, and remember, it's really not over Egypt. It was that Hyksos invasion. And that's why the king didn't know. We talked about that in the Old Testament. Look back there, for instance, in Exodus 1, just to remind you of these things. I remember reading just, a couple of days ago in a theological journal, an article about this, so it's fresh on my memory. I didn't remember it until I said it right then, though. But the problem that we've got about this verse back here in Exodus chapter 1, Exodus 1 and verse 8. Now we know that Joseph, we know from the last few chapters of Genesis how important of a man Joseph became in Egypt, that he was second only behind Pharaoh himself. We know that the Egyptians were very meticulous in keeping records about all types of things. So the assumption would follow that whether or not we've got the same Pharaoh as leader in Egypt, those that came after him would certainly know about this man Joseph, either by word of mouth or certainly by the records. And yet, looking here at verse 8, now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. Many scholars have puzzled, how could he not know Joseph? The greatest man in Egypt, greatest foreigner, the greatest man next to Pharaoh himself. Well, as they translate it there on the chart, there arose a new king against Egypt, which shows that he's not an Egyptian king who knew not Joseph. Well, if we got this foreign invasion of the Hyksos people, which we do around 730 BC, then it only follows that the king of the Hyksos people would not know anything about Joseph. And that's why we've got that, 70-year period that we skipped between the end of the period of the Hebrew patriarchs, 1800, and the beginning of Egyptian slavery, 1730. Because it wasn't the Egyptians that started all of this. It was the Hyksos invasion in Egypt. We've discussed all of that before. How many of you remember that, or at least remember the name?
Amen.
Well, that's good. Because a lot of people just from Sunday school think, well, it was old Egypt that started all of this. No, it wasn't either. It was this invading people. The Hyksos people, they, of course, were finally expelled from Egypt themselves. So Egyptian slavery and deliverance, and besides that, we have to end up with the right amount of time here. 1730 through 1447. Because in many places in Scripture, we find that they were in Egypt for this period of time. Then in the fourth place, the conquest and organization. The conquest and organization of Canaan. The books of Joshua and Judges. The date from 1407 down to, who wants to guess? No?
967.
The conquest, you're getting close, the conquest and organization of Canaan. Joshua and Judges down to around 1050 BC. 1407, that gives us our period of wandering in the wilderness between those 2 points. For Joshua actually going in 1407 to 1050. And we're not the type of people who are so much hung up on a date that we'll be disappointed when we get to heaven if it was 1421 instead of 1407. Doesn't make me any difference. But you've got to remember something. You can't just think, well, it was back there somewhere. So pick a date out that seems to be the most reliable and then remember it. A lot of people have problems with dates, but you've got to remember some date. You have to know what today's date is and what tomorrow is. Otherwise, you might sleep in and think, well, I don't have to go to work tomorrow. You've got to know about dates. So we just pick a date, 1407, that's reasonable, that fits the facts of history. It can't be 3407, that's for sure. So 1407 down to 1050. Conquest and organization of Canaan. Remember, Joshua goes in and takes the land, but then it takes a long time for the land to be organized and divided out, and for the people even to come close to taking the possession of the land that rightfully, according to God and His Word, belongs to them. Which gives us, in the fifth place, what period would come next? The kingdom period. See, you didn't know we were going to be doing an OT intro tonight, so you couldn't have brushed up on all this at home. So that's good that you remember this. The kingdom period. Here we have books like Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. And what else would fit here? The vast majority of the prophets. Not all of them, but the vast majority of the prophets would fit in the kingdom period. And what would be the dates? See, you could be the teacher tonight, couldn't you? Well, we'll wait till we get to some new stuff, though. What would be the dates for the kingdom period? 1050 to what? 586. If I had some bubble gum, I'd pass it out tonight. We also have, of course, the fall of Israel happening 722, and then Judah 586. So the kingdom period closes with the close of the kingdom of Israel and Judah. The next period would be what? I might as well let you finish if you're doing so well. Captivity. What's the period of captivity? 606 to 536. You got to get the full 70 years in there. It really begins. Remember, there are three different carryings away, with Daniel in 606, and later with Ezekiel, and then finally with the whole city, 586 BC. Some of you out there are probably jealous that some others know a lot of knowledge that you don't know because you didn't pay attention back in the Old Testament introduction. See, it's easy. It just looks hard when you hear it for the first time.
Amen.
But now after we've gone over it so many times, it's like brushing your teeth.
Amen.
Then what's the next period? The seventh and final period. Restoration, the period of Jewish restoration. By the way, the books of Daniel and Ezekiel fit in with captivity. We just mentioned both of their names. Daniel and Ezekiel fit in with captivity. Then finally, restoration, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Fit in here. And what would be the dates? 536 down to what? 400. 536 down to 400 BC. And then the next period would be the intertestamental period. That's what we'll be getting to later on, from 400 down to 0. So that takes us from the beginning of time down to the time of Jesus. So this is where the Old Testament record leaves us with this period of restoration. Israel's now back in her land. There's a partial return from Babylonian captivity. The power has passed from the hands of the Babylonians to the Medo-Persian rulers. And that just prepares us. Then the Old Testament ends, and that prepares us for looking into the intertestamental period. Now, the only way that we can look politically at the history of Israel during these closing Old Testament years, as well as taking in to our study the intertestamental period, is to consider the four world Gentile kingdoms as set forth in Daniel 2, 7, and 8, which I think you find there on your outline, the beginning anyway. You find the beginnings of it concerning Daniel's four world Gentile kingdoms: Babylon, Medo-Persia, the Greeks, and the Romans. But before looking at these kingdoms, there are two kingdoms, two Gentile kingdoms that come earlier in Israel's history, and both of them are important. The first of those we're just going to mention by name because their importance was so much earlier it would take us way back into Old Testament history to discuss them very much, and the second will be our subject tonight. The former of those would be the nation of Egypt. The first of the great kingdoms of the world that influenced Israel in any way would be the Egyptians. We already talked about Egyptian slavery and deliverance. Egypt declines in power around this time. She rises again on several occasions later. As a matter of fact, she's on the rise right around the time that Judah finally falls, 606 to 586 BC. But that's when the Pharaoh Necho is finally crushed, and we have an end to Egyptian dominance. The second kingdom, not included in Daniel because these kingdoms that Daniel has included come after him, would be the Assyrian kingdom. The Assyrian kingdom. And that is going to be our topic tonight. The Assyrians. Totally different than the Syrians that the Old Testament, that your King James Version mentions. The Syrians, the Assyrians are two different groups of people. The word Syrian should always be translated the Aramaeans in the Old Testament. It wasn't known. They simply weren't known as Assyrians, and the Hebrew word doesn't even come close to our word Syria. Now, it refers to the same general area, but just because it refers to the same general area as what, well, even down to this day is known as Syria, doesn't mean you can call them by a name that they're not called by yet at that time whenever the Hebrew word is different. So we're not going to run those references. There's probably dozens of them in the Old Testament that talk about the Syrians. So whenever you have the time, get your concordance out and change all of them to the Aramaeans, and you'll be more correct. But that still doesn't help us completely solve the mystery of the Assyrians and who these people are. We can rule out right away the Syrians or the Arameans, but there are three other words that appear in the Old Testament, all three of which relate to this kingdom that we're going to begin talking about tonight, and then one word that's very similar that doesn't, and then two other words that refer to two distinct groups of people that are different than the Assyrians. So let's point those out. First of all, the two groups of people, because the names, as you'll see, become confusing because they're so similar. The first place, I'm not even going to give you references because they're not important, like they're mentioned maybe one or two times in the Old Testament. The Ashurites, A-S-H-U-R-I-T-E-S. The Ashurites were a tribe in northern Israel. No one really knows exactly who they were or to whom they were related. Some of the Targums amend this to read the men of Asher, since the tribe of Asher was located in northern Israel. I'm not saying that's right or that's wrong. As far as I know, it's not right. I'm just going to leave it the Ashurites. Then there's another group of people known as the Ashurim, A-S-S-H-U-R-I-M. And this was a tribe located in northern Arabia. And as far as we know, they weren't related, but there's not a lot known about those people. So we can rule them out. We're not talking about them whenever we're talking about the nation of Assyria. Then there's another word that we're not talking about, Asher, A-S-H-U-R. I want to show you two places and give you the more correct spelling. They're both over in 1 Chronicles. One in chapter 2, verse 24, one in chapter 4 and verse 5. A-S-H-U-R, Asher. They both refer to a man, the man's name, certainly not a country or a group of people. 1 Chronicles 2 and verse 24. After that Hezron was dead, Caleb Ephratah, then Abiah, Hezron's wife, bare him Asher, the father of Tekoa. And a better spelling from the Hebrew would be to add an extra H. Put a double H instead of a single H in the word, is really what the Hebrew has. And the same man's name is found over in chapter 4 and verse 5. Asher, A-S-H-U-R, the father of Tekoa. You say, well, that never would have caused me any problem. I know that Asher and Assyria certainly couldn't be related. Well, that depends on how you spell it. Because now we're going to get to three words that do relate to our subject tonight, and the first of those is Asher, the same word. But instead of a double H, it's got a double S. It's found about 8 times in the Old Testament. Let's see, I'll give you the references and we'll either look at them or comment on them. Genesis 10, verse 11 and verse 22. Numbers 24, verses 22 and 24. 1 Chronicles 1:17. Ezekiel 27:23 and 32:22. And Hosea 14:3. So that's a long way. That's from Genesis all the way down to Hosea. Now in Genesis 10 and verse 22, it refers to a man. It refers to the same man in 1 Chronicles 1:17. It's a man's name. Evidently the founding father of the people of Assyria, because later on his name also becomes synonymous with Assyria, such as the passages in Numbers 24, verses 22 and 24. It uses the same word, Asher, A-S-S-H-U-R, but it's not referring to a man, it's referring to evidently his descendants, which became a country, the country of Assyria. Then in both of the passages in Ezekiel, it refers to the land or the country or the people again, as well as in Hosea, Hosea 14:3. which leaves us with only one peculiar passage, which we've mentioned before, but we'll go back and look at it, Genesis 10 and verse 11. Here it's going to refer to a country, refer to a land, a geographical location. But the marginal reading is the correct reading. And out of that land went forth Asher. Well, he's not been born until we get down to verse 22. The sons of Shem, Elam, and Asher. See, he's not even born until we get down to verse 22. So how could we... Maybe you're not there yet. Genesis 10, we're looking at verses 11 and 22. How can we already have him in verse 11 when he's not born until verse 22? So it should read, out of that land, he, speaking of Nimrod, because that's what the passage is about, verse 11, in the margin. Out of that land, he went forth into Assyria. So there we've got Assyria or Asher. And by the way, the Hebrew name is exactly the same. Why King James gave it to us two different ways, I don't know. But just soon leave it that way. Well, you could change it and make Assyria refer to the country and Ashur refer to the man, but you're only going to need two times for it to refer to the man anyway. One's here in Genesis 10 and verse 22, and then the other one would be the passage over there in 1 Chronicles 1:17. But anyway, if you've got a marginal reading, that's the correct one here, because this doesn't make any sense otherwise. Out of that land, which land? Babylon. He started in Babylon. This is where the Tower of Babel was built. Verse 10. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Most scholars feel that's just an ancient name for Babylonia. Out of that land, so we're talking about from Babylon to Assyria, he, the margin said, went. Well, who's the he? Well, it's the context. Nimrod went into Assyria, and we see that he built these various cities. So that takes care of the Asher that should be a double H, and the Asher that should be and is a double S. You see how confusing it could be, though. One's a double H and one's a double S, and they're two entirely different things. And yet the Hebrew is almost identical. Then there's another word. There's the word Assur. It's the same as Ashur, the double S one, but you drop the H. A-S-S-U-R. Now it's found in Psalm 83 in verse 8. Well, let's go over there and look at that. It may not have a reference to Assyria. It may have a reference, again, to some unknown nomadic tribe. It doesn't really make any difference, but it does talk about different nomadic tribes here. The Ishmaelites, Moabites, Ammonites, Amalek, Philistines, Tyre. It's talking about all these nations that are right, or these people right over there around Israel. And then it says Assyr has also joined them. So that may be a little difficult to be reaching way over to where Assyria is, up on the northern Tigris, between the northern Tigris and the Great Zab River. It may be a little difficult to go that far, and so some people have suggested perhaps it refers to another group of people around there. And maybe that's true, but it's not going to affect our understanding one way or the other, except to have you make a notation of that. Then in Ezra 4 in verse 2, this is where we find that word again, A-S-S-U-R, and here it refers to the land of Assyria. So it's definite, whereas Psalm 83:8 wouldn't be that definite. So that goes to the Ashurites, the Ashurim that don't concern us, Ashur double H that doesn't concern us, Ashur double S, which does, Assur double S drop the H, which does, and then finally the name that we're using that's familiar is Assyria. Assyria, found everywhere from Genesis 2:14 to Zechariah 10:11. That's from the beginning to almost the very end of the Old Testament. numerous scores of references. Obviously, I didn't write them all down, but from Genesis 2:14 through Zechariah 10 and verse 11. Now we know that civilization began over in the Mesopotamian region. We know it began probably down in southern Babylon or Babylonia somewhere. If you go back to that passage over there in Genesis 10, we see that civilization very shortly after the Tower of Babel moved out of southern Babylonia up into the northern Mesopotamia region, which takes us up into the area that's referred to as Assyria. Remember that everything that we have in Genesis 10 and 11 is not necessarily in chronological order, because probably we've got verse 10 of chapter 10. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. And what that's talking about would be the first 9 verses of chapter 11. This building of the tower and the city whose top is heaven. And so after God, remember, confounds their language and then he scatters the people, they go into different directions. And so probably then verse 11 of chapter 10 would be a partial fulfillment of that. Out of that land, out of Babylon, after the scattering of the people via confusion of tongues, out of that land, this leader, Nimrod, went into Assyria. So he simply went up north. And we said in the creation teachings that the way in which the Stone Age cultures came about was the stronger nations remained, or the stronger family clans remained in that area, and those that were weaker were pushed off into the extent places of the face of the earth, which meant that they were without the help of others, they were without natural resources, they were without their technology that they had back here when they were in Mesopotamia, which means evidently since Nimrod only goes up into Assyria, he must have had still a big following with him at this time, because he stays pretty much in this area. It's a real fertile area. Assyria really has a little better climate than Babylon does. She has a lot of natural rocks to do all of her building with. Remember, according to chapter 11, verse 3, and just according to the geography of Babylonia itself, Babylonia doesn't have a lot of natural rocks and stones and things to use in order to build your building. The only way you get your building is to get your mud and make it into little bricks and have it dried out either in a furnace or by the sun. And that, according to chapter 11, verse 3, and just according to the geography of Babylonia itself, Babylonia doesn't have a lot of natural rocks and stones and things to use in order to build your building. The only way you get your building is to get your mud and make it into little bricks and have it dry your building material. So he really went into a better area when he got up into the higher plateaus, not so much of the heat that they had down in Babylon, but when he gets up into the higher plateaus of Assyria. And notice the end of that 11th verse. He went on, this Nimrod, to build some cities here. And one of the cities is one of the most famous ones in the Old Testament, the great city of Nineveh. Now, the Assyrians had their capital in the first place at their city of Ashur, A-S-H-U-R. Here we go back to names, but another name, different than the other ones. Now, understand that the overhead is not working tonight, so hopefully you've got some maps in your Bible. If you do, turn back there and find a map with Assyria, Babylon, so we can familiarize ourselves with this part of the globe. We've talked about this area a lot before. We've looked at this area a lot before. But now we're concentrating specifically on the Assyrian kingdom. Now we have the two great famous rivers in this part of the world, the Tigris, which is the easternmost of the rivers, and Euphrates, only 25 miles apart from one another, in the highlands of Armenia. They both flow down together until they meet and finally empty into the Persian Gulf. The Tigris River is the important river concerning Assyria. because Assyria is located between the upper Tigris River and the Great Zab River. There's a greater and a lesser Zab River, and hopefully your map will at least have the Great Zab River. You found a map of the time of the patriarchs, or whatever yours might say to give you a Babylonian experience? Cities are built there. But their great capital, first of all, was at Ashur, A-S-H-U-R. And this goes back as far as 2000 BC. 2000 BC. They were a people that existed that long ago, 2000 BC. And then sometime after that, no one knows exactly when, the capital was moved up to Nineveh. Now hold your finger there. I think there's another thing back there in that Genesis 10 passage. See, Genesis 10 and verse 11 mentions Nineveh. And then you see that it mentions that city, Caleb. That's a good way to find where we're talking about Assyria. You can find Caleb. Simply an ancient name for the Tigris. Now, remember in Genesis 2:14, we're all the way back to the Garden of Eden time. So that's how long these rivers have been there. Talking about this land that's compassed by these 4 different rivers, and it mentions them, the Pison, the Gihon, and then 2 more found in verse 14. By the way, in each one of these, verse 11, the Pison, he gives us a description. He said that encompasses the land of Havilah. Then the Gihon, verse 13, that encompasseth the land of Cush. Then verse 14, the name of the 3rd river is Hiddekel. That is it which goeth toward the east of Assyria. Now don't try to get too confused in your mind over directions, because you don't know exactly what happened. Of the chart, again on the same horizontal line, you pass through a variety of kings. We're not going to look at all of those because they're not that important with regard to Israel until we get down to 745 through 727. We'll give you the names and the dates of these various important kings. 745 through 727, Tiglath-Pileser III. Tiglath-Pileser III. He's also referred to as Tilgath-Pileser III in the Old Testament. Either Tiglath-Pileser or Tilgath-Pileser III. You go to different books, or sometimes I think it's in the same book, and evidently a copyist has given just a little bit different spelling. And so it's best just to leave them different, but they're close enough so you know you're talking about the same individual. Probably the first name I gave you, Tiglath-Pileser III, is the more correct of the two. 745 to 727. Okay, let's start looking at a few passages. We're going to look at the passages where we find these kings interacting in the history of Israel. And we're going to find this in Kings and Chronicles. Tiglath-Pileser III. 2 Kings chapter 15. We're going to find him a couple of times here, but I think we'll only look at one and then we'll have to come back for the other. 2 Kings chapter 15, beginning with verse 27. You can look on your chart and see the different kings in Israel that we're talking about. The 52nd year of Azariah, king of Judah, Pekah, the son of Remaliah, began to reign over Israel in Samaria and reigned 20 years. So we're talking about King Pekah in Israel. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. He departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, which is that recurrent phrase in the Old Testament. In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, came Tiglath-Pileser, long name, easy to say, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. So here's the first time we've got Tiglath-Pileser. And see, it meshes out perfectly on the chart because you see that Tiglath-Pileser lived during the same period as Pekah, king of Israel. But the rest of the verse is what we want. We got his name now. In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, came Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and took Ijon and Abel-Beth-Maachah and Genoa and Kedesh and Hazor. Don't read on yet. Where are all these places? You probably don't know. Let's keep going and you'll find out. And Gilead and Galilee and all the land of Naphtali. So where are we talking about? Where's Galilee in Israel? Northern. And these others are either northern or eastern, and carried them captive to Assyria. So the comment that I want to make about Tiglath-Pileser III is that he took the eastern and northern captives from Israel during the reign of King Pekah around 735 BC. Now this isn't the fall of the kingdom or anything. He comes over and takes captives. He takes certain geographical districts of Israel in eastern and northern Israel. During the time of King Pekah in Israel, around 735 BC. Then he's seen in chapter 16, verse 7. I believe this gets us into Ahaz's reign. 16:7, 16:10, 2 Chronicles 28:20, 1 Chronicles 5:6, and then in two other passages, and these are two difficult ones that I want to point something out about. 2 Kings 15, the same chapter we were in, verse 19. Now we just saw in verse 29 that in the days of Pekah, then Tiglath-Pileser came and took part of northern and part of eastern Israel. Look in verse 19. We're talking now about a couple of kings prior in Israel to Pekah, and Pul, king of Assyria, came against the land, and Menahem, now this is another king in Israel, Menahem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver, that his hand might be with him to confirm the kingdom in his hand. Verse 20, he took it. Into verse 20, so the king of Assyria turned back and stayed not there in the land. Well, Pul was the former name of Tiglath-Pileser. They're talking about the same individual, but Pul was his earlier name. So in other words, we see him coming into Israel in the first place in verse 19 for the first time. He comes in with another name, Pul. This shows the accuracy, by the way, of the historian of 2 Kings. He gives us the correct name for the correct time during this Assyrian monarch's rule. His name is Pul when he first comes. He's bought off the 1,000 talents of silver, and he doesn't harm Israel. That's during the time of Menahem. He comes back, verse 29, during the time of Pekah, and he does bother the nation because he takes captives from northern and eastern Israel around 735. Now I want to show you how we can prove that they're the same from a verse over in 2 Chronicles, or 1 Chronicles 5 and verse 26. I think it's the last verse, a long verse in 1 Chronicles 5, verse 26. Depending on what version you have, you may not have it right as far as translation goes, because we're going to have a falsity here. The God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, and the spirit of Tilgath-Pilneser. By the way, there's where you see his name spelled in the one of two ways I said it could be spelled, king of Assyria, and carried them away. Even the Reubenites, the Gadites, the half-tribe of Manasseh. Well, where's all that? That's eastern. That's eastern Israel. So it's talking about the same king, the same people being carried away. And he took them to Halah, Habor, Hera, and the river of Gozan unto this day. Where are all those places? Well, that's over in Media. That's where the Medes and the Persians, especially the Medes, originated later on. Well, it looks like he's talking about two people here, doesn't it? Yeah. But the and shouldn't be there. Really, you have to kind of supply a word yourself, such as the word even or the word that is, because the second name is simply explanatory of the first one. Otherwise, you end up with two people. And so your better, more modern version today will strike the and out, because this is what he means. The God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, that is, the spirit of Tilgath-Pilneser. In other words, he's just saying, I'm telling you who this is, because now, later on, he's gone by his regular name, or his more modern name, Tiglath-Pileser, or Tilgath-Pilneser. So you can strike out and just leave it blank, and just notice that the comma means that what's following is explanatory. and then you pick up with the "and he carried them away" when you get there, or you can supply the word "even" or the phrase "that is," which means that his second listing, I'm saying, is explanatory of the first one, which proves the verses we just looked at back in 2 Kings chapter 15, verses 19 and 29. Because one time it mentions him as Pul, the second time as Tiglath-Pileser. Okay, there's one king. Let's go to a second king. Do as many as we can. There's one king you see around when he lives. And the next one on the chart doesn't rule very long. Shalmaneser the fifth, 727 to 722. Shalmaneser the fifth. He's seen over in 2 Kings chapters 17 and 18. He is the king who besieged Samaria for 3 years whenever Hoshea, the last king in Israel, refused to give him tribute but tried to get aid from So, king in Egypt, which we'll find explained in one of our passages here. 2 Kings 17. Second Kings 17, verses 3 through 6. You see, you have to know your history of Israel during this time. Know your kings, and then you know where we are. So that's why I always encourage you to bring your charts. They didn't have charts back then in Israel, but we've got them today. You might not have one in the kingdom age, so it's good to use yours while you got it now. And it helps you follow along. You can see all the names, and you can see them in order. But you notice, you ought to already have memorized the date of the fall of Israel, 722, and notice that just happens to be the end of Israel, 727 to 722. That's interesting. And it's going to be noteworthy here in a moment. 2 Kings 17:3. Against him came up Shalmaneser. We give them numbers because that means that there were at least 4 before him. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria. And Hoshea became his servant and gave him presents. Well, the honeymoon didn't last very long, because the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and brought no present to the king of Assyria, as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. And look at verse 5. Then the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land, and went up to Samaria, and besieged it 3 years. And in the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Assyria, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria. There's the end of the northern kingdom of Israel. Then over in chapter 18, verses 9 through 11. Talking about the same time. It's talking about the same king. It mentions him, for instance, in verse 9. It also happens to mention Hezekiah, because that's going to become important here in this chapter. And then over in Hosea, chapter 10, I think it's verse 14. This may be a reference to him. If it is, then the battle that is spoken of here is unknown. If it's not him, then neither is the battle known, nor is the man. Hosea 10 and verse 14. Therefore shall a tumult arise among the people, and all thy fortresses shall be spoiled, as Shalman spoiled Betharbel in the day of battle. The mother was dashed in pieces upon her children. Well, that looks like probably we have on our hands here simply a shortened form of Shalmaneser. They just shortened it to Shalman. If that's not Shalmaneser the fifth, then we don't know who it is. But we know from these verses we just looked at that he's an important figure in Assyrian as well as in Old Testament Jewish history, so probably Hosea is talking about the same individual. Okay, a third king. We're going right historically in order because this is the important time where they come into play. in the history of the nation of Israel. Sargon the Second. Sargon the Second, 722 through 705. Now he's mentioned only one time by name in the Bible. The critics have had a field day with the one reference because of a lack for so many years of a historical proof that anyone by the name of Sargon, this Sargon II, ever did really exist. So we're happy to say that since the time all the critics really proved that he could never have existed, archaeological discoveries have proven that he did indeed exist as a king, and as a king by that name, Sargon II. So Isaiah chapter 20 in verse 1 is the only time that he's mentioned by name in Scripture. You see, because the extant records of Assyria didn't happen to show a Sargon II, the archaeologists said that he probably never existed. That was a mistake in the Bible. But since those days, they got more enlightened because he was found. And he's called Sargon by name there. But he also appears back here in 2 Kings chapter 18, except that his name is not mentioned. And it's real subtle the way that he's found here, and this is what I want to point out to you concerning what I said a moment ago, that it's interesting. Shalmaneser's date for his death, 722, is the same for the date of the fall of Samaria, 722. And we know that the city had been besieged for 3 years according to 2 Kings chapter 17 and verse 5. We know that Shalmaneser V had been the Assyrian king who was besieging the city for 3 years. And so it's very interesting that the concluding date is the same in both accounts, 722. And so according to the records of Assyria, Shalmaneser V was not the one who actually took the city. He was the one who instigated the besieging of the city. He was the one who carried it through all the way until almost the very end. And right before the city fell, this is what the records show, right before the city fell, he died, and Sargon II came to the throne. He was his military commander on the battle scene anyway, and it was actually to the credit of Sargon II that the fall of Samaria and Israel has been given. And let me show you how this could even be true according to our Old Testament. It's a very subtle way. Let's look, for instance, in 2 Kings 18, verses 9 through 11. Because some people have said, well, here's another contradiction. The records show that Sargon was the captor of Samaria and Israel. But yet our Bible tells us that Shalmaneser besieged the city for 3 years and finally took it. Well, it doesn't actually say that here. And it came to pass in the 4th year of King Hezekiah, which was the 7th year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, that Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against Samaria and besieged it. And at the end of 3 years, they took it. Now all of a sudden we've got a plural pronoun here. These things are very subtle here. Even in the 6th year of Hezekiah, that is, in the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Israel, Samaria was taken. So now the battle is over with, the city's been taken, and then look at verse 11, and now for some reason it doesn't call him Shalmaneser. And the king of Assyria, who's not Shalmaneser, Shalmaneser's dead, now we're talking about Sargon II. This is what the records show, and the Bible proves that this could be true. See, if it would have said in verse 11, Shalmaneser, we're in trouble then. Because Shalmaneser was not the one that carried Israel away into Assyria. It was Sargon. Sometimes the records seem to imply that it was to Shalmaneser's credit, but that's only because he was in control, he was king, he was in control of the fighting for almost 3 years. Almost until the city fell. But not quite. And so that's why the official records show that it was Sargon II. And my point is that these 3 verses in 2 Kings 18 fully allow that. Fully allow for the fact that Shalmaneser did not really conquer the city, But he died just prior to 722 and the actual fall of the city. And so here's what we've got. Verse 9, we have Shalmaneser as the one who has taken up the siege against the city. And this is very interesting, the way the historian has set this up. In verse 10, he gives us the plural pronoun they, because he's just working into including Sargon. He's still talking about Shalmaneser and Sargon. He's talking about Shalmaneser still, but now he includes Sargon. Because it's going to go, in other words, from singular, verse 9, to plural, verse 10, because Sargon was certainly working with Shalmaneser, back to singular, verse 11, because now Shalmaneser is dead. Very unique way to set this up. So you've got Shalmaneser, then verse 10, they, plural, then verse 11, back to the singular, but it doesn't say the name, Shalmaneser. And the king of Assyria did carry away Israel into Assyria, which would be Sargon II. So he's mentioned by name only one place, Isaiah 20 and verse 1, but he's implied in 2 Kings 18, verse 10, and then verse 11. So after the death of Shalmaneser, during the siege of Samaria, Sargon is the one who actually takes Israel in 722 BC. Okay, the fourth king, Sennacherib, mentioned, by the way, more often than any of the other kings, I think, than all of them put together. Sennacherib, 705 to 681. So we're not concerned about Israel anymore. Israel has fallen in the very first year of Sargon II's reign. Now you can skip down and see primarily we're talking about the king of Judah, Hezekiah, and the prophet of Judah, Isaiah. Isaiah and Hezekiah are the ones in the Bible that come into play with this king Sennacherib. He was the son of Sargon II, who invaded Judah in 701. Again, you've got it on your chart just above the name Hezekiah. In 701 BC, during the time of King Hezekiah and prophet Isaiah. Now prior to this, he had already been taking tribute from Judah, according to 2 Kings 18, verses 13 through 16. He had already been taking tribute from Judah, but now he actually attacks with the purpose of taking the city of Jerusalem and the people of Judah. So his name is seen so often, I'm just going to give you the chapters. 2 Kings 18 and 19, 2 Chronicles 32, and Isaiah 36 to 37. Remember, he was the one that sent Rabshakeh and the others to blaspheme the name of God and say, now if the other nations and cities of the world have not been able to resist us and their gods haven't helped them, then who's to say Yahweh is going to help you? And remember, all the people on the wall heard this, and Hezekiah's envoy said, be quiet, don't say that so loud, you're scaring the people on the wall. And he just said it the louder. And then it's interesting that it says in Isaiah's account that the people on the wall didn't answer him a word because Hezekiah had said, your comment is to be no comment. And so they said nothing at all because that's what Hezekiah told them. Don't say anything. Because he knew if you get talking with the enemy, then you're going to get yourself bound up in fear. And so remember how Hezekiah takes the letter before the Lord and prays before the Lord, and Isaiah's interceding in the whole business. And then if you look over in Isaiah 37, here's where we see some of Isaiah's prophecy. Isaiah 37, beginning with verse 6. Here's some of his prophecies against old, highly lifted up Sennacherib. It's very vivid in what he says. And Isaiah said unto them, thus shall ye say unto your master. Remember, Hezekiah has sent some people to Isaiah, the son of Amos, to find out what should he do. Thus saith the Lord, be not afraid of the words that thou hast heard, wherewith the servants of the king of Assyria hath blasphemed me. Behold, I will send a blast upon him. And boy, did he blast him with the angel of the Lord. And he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land. And this is exactly what takes place. Skip down to verse 35, same chapter. God says, I will defend this city to save it for mine own sake and for my servant David's sake. Then the angel of the Lord went forth and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000.
Hallelujah.
One of the greatest defeats in military history. 185,000 slain without a bullet shot or a javelin thrown. When they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. Now, I'll tell you what, you could really get a faith lesson out of that. That God doesn't need anything but himself to protect you, to bless you, to heal you, or whatever. He didn't need all the armies of Israel. He sent his angel and slew almost 250,000 men. We don't know how he did it. I mean, he could have just gone through there with the sword of the Lord. Like Gideon, the sword of the Lord in Gideon, the sword of the Lord, and just smote all of them. It says, when they arose early in the morning, behold, and this is very graphic, they were all dead corpses. Their life was gone. They were all dead.
Wow.
A lot of ancient accounts in history want to tell us that what happened was some mice were sent into the area and chewed the bowstrings of the Assyrians in half. This is what one of the ancient historians, how he explains this account, because there is in the ancient records the fact that in one of Assyria's great battles, it doesn't talk a lot about Israel, but in one of Assyria's great battles in the past under Sennacherib, she lost many, many men, and she lost the battle when she should have won because she had the city circled. And so the explanation is mice got into the area and chewed the bowstrings in half, and they all had to turn around and go home. Another one was the mice were sitting in there and chewed the bowstrings in half, and then all the people caught the bubonic plague from the mice, and that's what killed them. But the Bible says the angel of the Lord slew all of these people. And if you have a problem with that, then you're just going to have a problem with the whole Old Testament. How do you know that God is God if you don't believe this verse here? And how about what the psalm is saying, that the angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him and delivereth them? And here is the best, the most notable literal example of that. When you've got an angel of the Lord coming and killing almost 250,000 men. That is divine protection. Now, Sennacherib wasn't killed until he gets back home to fulfill verse 7. He goes back home and he is smitten by some of his own relatives. His own 2 sons, as a matter of fact. We see down in verse 38, which we'll look at in a moment, because now we want to conclude with a couple of other kings that aren't as significant as these first 4. Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser V, Sargon II, and Sennacherib. By far, Sennacherib is the most important because he's given so much space over there in the 2 chapters in 2 Kings, the 1 chapter in 2 Chronicles, and these 2 chapters in Isaiah. But all 4 of these kings are important because we see them mentioned right in the Bible as they are coming on the scene of history with regard to Israel. But then there are 2 other Assyrian kings mentioned by name. The next one would be Esarhaddon. Again, all of these can still be found on the chart. Esarhaddon, 681 to 669. And he's mentioned in the verse that we just passed over, Isaiah 37 and verse 38. Came to pass as he, Sennacherib, to fulfill verse 7, was worshiping in the house of Nisroch his god, that Adramelech and Sharezer his son smote him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Ararat, as we change back in creation, and Esarhaddon, at least he had 3 sons, Esarhaddon his son reigned in his stead. So he's mentioned there. He's mentioned in 2 Kings 19:37. And then he's mentioned over in Ezra chapter 4 and verse 2, which fulfills Isaiah 7 and verse 8, prophecies of what is going to take place in 65 years according to the prophet Isaiah. But anyway, he's found by name over in Ezra chapter 4 and verse 2. 681 to 669. Now you see, Israel has already fallen at this time, and Sennacherib has been defeated terribly in his attempt to take over Judah in 701. So from this time on, we really don't have a big deal to do with the Assyrians as they are related to Israel. It's primarily from Tiglath-Pileser III down through Sennacherib. Then the final king that's mentioned that's of any real importance would be Ashurbanipal, 669 down to 633. You see, all those names are fairly familiar just because they're in the Bible, or all of them except Ashurbanipal. And you get after that, and you're finding names that aren't familiar because they really don't have anything to do with Israel, because you don't find them in the Old Testament. For one thing, Ashurbanipal going all the way down to 633, Assyria doesn't exist, but just a couple of more decades anyway. So she doesn't have very long to have any kings that are of any importance. And if you look on your chart, you see the Neo-Babylonian Empire starts 626, and they are the ones now who rise to power, and so Assyria passes off the scene. So this Ashurbanipal is the only one of the final kings who is of any importance. Yes, he's found one time in the Bible, not by that name. He's found over in Ezra chapter 4, verse 10. Ezra 4 and verse 10. We said in verse 2, there's Esarhaddon found again. But verse 10 of Ezra 4, here we have Asnapar, which evidently was just another name for Ashurbanipal. The rest of the nations whom the great and noble Asnapper, 669 BC, brought over and set in the cities of Samaria, the rest that are on this side of the river and at such a time. So Asnapper refers to Ashurbanipal. Even if you didn't know from the name, you can determine from the chronology that he's the next king after Esarhaddon, so it has to be another name for Ashurbanipal. So he's a blessing because that's the only place we find him. You don't have to remember all these other places. Just one time as Asnapper. Then the last thing that's of any importance with regard to Assyria, remember we're only talking about her because she's leading up to the 4 world Gentile kingdoms of Daniel chapters 2, 7, and 8. So we're covering her because she does come into play in Israel's history. We've got to kind of work our way down step by step historically to get down to the time between the Testament. That next important thing would be 612 BC and the fall of the great city of Nineveh. Jonah had prophesied of the doom of the Ninevites back in 782 BC. And remember, God gave them another opportunity because from the king of Assyria down to the lowest slave, they all repented in sackcloth and ashes and fasting, even down to the animals. So they were spared from the great judgments that Jonah pronounced upon them. But then in 650 BC, Nahum comes on the scene, prophesies for the second time against the great city of Nineveh, which had become, remember, the capital of the Assyrians. And in Nahum chapter 2, we have a description of the coalition of the Babylonians, the Medes, and the Scythians who converge upon Nineveh with a variety of different tactics. They get the water of the Tigris River to flow underneath the wall of the city to destroy the city, and the city falls in 612. You might want to turn over to Nahum, and I'll point out a couple of interesting things. Nahum chapter 2. This is what the prophecy is against. Notice the very first verse, the burden of Nineveh. The burden of Nineveh. Now, you couldn't get away with teaching this message in your average church, but God's got a whole book in his Bible about it. Nahum, 2 whole books. Jonah. And then if you want to take all of those verses over in Kings and Chronicles and Isaiah, it must be important to him. I mean, I find that interesting that here we've got recorded in canonical scripture the burden of Nineveh. Why didn't God say, well, that's not important for salvation? That's what everyone else says. That's not important for salvation. I'll inspire a message that will inspire the people. Well, he didn't inspire that type here. This is a message of doom and destruction. Chapter 3, verse 1, woe to the bloody city. That's what he's talking about, Nineveh. But chapter 2 is an account of its fall. He that dasheth in pieces is come up before thy face. Keep the munition, watch the way, make thy loins strong, fortify thy power mightily. Here's some very picturesque language, warning the people, it's time, get ready now. For the Lord hath turned away the excellency of Jacob as the excellency of Israel. For the emptiers have emptied them out and marred their vine branches. The shield of his mighty men is made red. Has to do with ancient Babylon. The valiant men are in scarlet. And the chariots shall be with flaming torches in the day of his preparation, and the fir trees shall be terribly shaken. The chariots shall rage in the streets, and they shall jostle one against another in the broad ways. He said that's how many chariots there'll be. They'll be bumping up against one another. They shall seem like torches. They shall run like the lightnings. He shall recount his worthies. They shall stumble in their walk. They shall make haste to the wall thereof, and the defense shall be prepared. The gates of the river shall be opened. They turned the course of the river and made it flow under the walls of Nineveh. And that's what flushed out the city, literally and militarily. The gates of the river shall be opened, and the palace shall be dissolved. Huzzab shall be led away captive. She shall be brought up, and her maids, so forth. Verse 8, but Nineveh is of old like a pool of water, flooded the city with the Tigris River, and so forth. And then chapter 3 is prophesying, I believe, some of the reasons why Nineveh fell and detailing how great her fall was. She's called in verse 4 the mistress of witchcrafts. So there's a lot of the occult and sorcery going on here. And it's mentioned Nineveh by name down, for instance, in verse 7 of chapter 3. And verse 10 details some of the episodes of the period of captivity. So there's the prophecy of Nahum that depicts the end of the Assyrian kingdom, which brings us to an end tonight and prepares us for the next kingdom next week, Babylon. Because Babylon is the next one to come on the scene. So there's a quick review of ancient Assyria.
What was, he said, for Nineveh, chapter 2, it described Babylon, and what was the other nation?
The Babylonians, the Medes, and the Scythians were the 3 nations that combined to destroy the Assyrians. The Babylonians, the Medes, and the Scythians.